everyone. Welcome to the October 15th edition of the TimeformUS Pacecast. I'm David Aragona. I'll be joined in just a second by my co-host, Craig Milkowski. This week on the podcast, we're going to recap Canadian International Day at Woodbine, the three stakes that took place there, including the EP Taylor and the Arctic. We'll talk about the Queen Elizabeth II Challenge Cup from Keeneland, as well as some other stakes races from Keeneland. One Breeders' Cup prep in particular that might have an impact on Friday races. Then some Belmont action. We'll wrap up by talking about some other venues, including Gulfstream Park West and Santa Anita. Craig, I'd recap our picks on the TimeformUS forecast from last week, but I don't think we really gave out anything clever. And I don't think we had strong opinions, and that's kind of how the races played out.
Yeah, it was. My only real strong one was Fire Key, and I mean 2-1. I'm not getting too excited about that. The rest, I think I learned my lesson on. I'm almost always against Euro sprinters when they ship over, and I jumped off of that this time, and that probably won't happen again for a long time.
Yeah, that one didn't work out too well for us. But let's start with the Canadian International, the big race at Woodbine last Saturday. And Desert Encounter pulled off the repeat victory in this spot. He had won it against a larger field last year, just 6 horses in this year's race. And he really blew the start. I mean, it looked for a second like he wasn't even coming out of the gate, like he was about to refuse to run. And then he left the gate about 5 or 6 lengths behind the rest of the field. So going 1.5 mile distance, it wasn't that big of a handicap because he got back into the race as they were going pretty slowly up front in the early going. Impressive late kick on this horse, though.
It was, and the race came back pretty fast. Now, I will give a little caution. The top 4 were all Euro horses, as we expected. No real surprise there, but it can make the figure making a little difficult, particularly when it's the only race at the distance, as obviously this one was at 1.5 miles. But he got a 130 for it, which, I mean, it makes sense for these horses. He's a good, strong horse. He won this race last year. I think it was with a 127, so I'm not sure how much we want to talk about this race, just as I don't know when we'll see these horses again. Maybe next year. I haven't heard if any of them are being pointed towards the Breeders' Cup, but it was a good race like this one always is.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. This horse is obviously a good one. He's not really a Group 1 type overseas, but coming over here, he's just going to dominate the local horses, especially when the top turf horses in Canada just aren't really they're not really grade 1 level this year. And I think that really showed in the fact that the 4 Euros were the first 4 across the wire. This race did get a surprisingly high figure. From a visual standpoint, I didn't see it being this kind of highly rated race, but I guess these are some pretty good horses. We'll move on to the EP Taylor for the fillies and mares. And cool to see Starship Jubilee get this victory. She's probably not a horse that really wants to go the 1.25 mile distance. She's really more of a mile or 1.125 type horse. But given how slowly they went early in this race, it really allowed her to use that late kick that she's got and just basically open up an insurmountable advantage at mid-stretch.
Yeah, she's a mare that I keep underrating. She became a millionaire with this win. The race basically was handed to her, as you say. The pace was kind of slow. She sat just off a Red Tea, who was actually favored shipping over at 3-1, but she really had nothing. Despite the slow pace, she dropped out of it. And when she did, Starship Jubilee just inherited the lead. And you give her slow fractions and she's going to finish off the race. She got a 121 TimeformUS speed figure for the win, which is right in the ballpark of which she always runs. And I guess she's just always going to be dangerous when the pace isn't hot and she's allowed to sit right up there near the front.
Yeah, and what surprised me about this race was that the other horses that were up close to the pace with her just weren't able to kick on in the stretch. Like Red Tea, the favorite, I mean, she had nothing after basically setting that slow pace that Starship Jubilee was stalking. She backed up. The other horses that were close up, like Holy Helena, they couldn't really produce a stretch kick. I thought the 2 Euro 3-year-old fillies ran okay. Durance, who finished second, and Platon, who came from probably the farthest back of anybody, who finished in the top few runners. She ran out okay to be third. I do want to mention just the speed figures for these 2 races, the Canadian International and the EP Taylor. We do see the European runners getting just huge figure boosts over the Timeform ratings that they earned over there. Is that just the nature of coming over to the US and maybe carrying a little bit less weight? Maybe just being in spots where they're better matched against competition that they can beat. Do you have a take on that?
Yeah, I think it does have to do with for one, the weight, as you say, though we do build that into our figures. It's not an exact science. They're generally not facing as tough a competition, and also Lasix. I don't think there's much doubt that horses run faster with Lasix. Most of all of these get Lasix when they come here. Not all, but most of them do, and I think that lends somewhat to the increased figures.
And Starship Jubilee, I think some people forget that she was actually a former claiming type. I think looking back on her PPs, she was actually claimed for $16,000 back towards the beginning of her career. It's just pretty cool to see her now become a Grade 1 winner and a millionaire, as you said. It's like the year of the 16 claimers turning into Grade 1 winners with this horse, Math Wizard, and of course, Maximum Security. Yeah. The final major race from Woodbine on Saturday was the New Arctic, although I think this race, there was a pretty big dip in quality from the other two, as this is just a Grade 2 event, and I can't even really call this a Grade 2 field because the horse that won it had never really been competitive in a stakes before, was coming out of a bunch of optional claiming losses. That's why he was 24-1, and I mean, to me, he looked like every bit of that price, but oddly enough, the pace that, or the fast pace that the pace projector was predicting to develop just never really came to fruition. And the horses that were up close early were just kind of able to hang on.
Yeah, this just wasn't a strong race. It was Grade 2 in name only. I don't even know if it's worthy of Grade 3 status based on the figure and the horses that finished in the top three. The winner and the second place finisher only got 109. TimeformUS speed figures. They didn't really have much in the way of credentials coming in. So this definitely wasn't as strong as the sprint we saw on Woodbine Mile Day, which was a little better than this one. So not a whole lot to say about this one other than, as I mentioned earlier, I learned my lesson. No more Euro sprinters shipping over here for me.
No, those don't work out that often, I guess. And I don't know if we're going to see any of these horses in the Breeders' Cup. I didn't read the quotes about that or anything. Maybe some of the Canadian international horses, but we'll see. Let's move on to the Keeneland races because we saw some interesting performances there. We'll begin with the Queen Elizabeth II Challenge Cup. This is a race that we talked about on the forecast on Friday. It was one that was going to be a rider's race because there was just no speed in there, no horses that had ever run effectively up or on the pace. And Cambier Park was the one who had shown the best tactical speed in her prior starts. And John Velasquez just put her on the lead. Nobody really offered any opposition, just let her set her own pace. And she was just too good for this field.
She was. And the only real note I made for this race was what a heady ride it was by John Velasquez. I mean, it was pretty obvious this horse had the speed, but we don't always see that play out just because it looks way on paper. We often see these turf races where we get some mystifying rides, but not here. He had the best horse. He put her on front. He set a slow pace and was able to win and win pretty easily. He got a 115 for the win, which is right up there with as good as she's run in her career. And you know, again, these fillies just aren't good enough to tackle the older at this point in their career, but she's a solid enough filly, and I imagine she'll get better, come back at 4 and be a force to be dealt with.
The other thing I wanted to note about this race is that when fields are so bunched like this and you have so little pace in the race, saving ground becomes really important. And I do think you have to be aware of the fact that the two horses that rode the rail for the entire race, Cambier Park and Castle Lady, just really seemed to be energized coming off that far turn. And especially at Keeneland, where those turns are so tight, it seems like if you really cut that corner, you can almost pick up a length or two on horses that are trying to come outside of you. And that's what those two did. And it really made the difference at the end when they're all trying to sprint to the wire. I mean, I don't know how much you want to upgrade horses like Cafe Americano and Varenka, who are probably the two that are most compromised by the pace and their wide trips. But from an overall perspective, I'm not sure how strong this race really was. I'm certain that we've seen better editions of the QE2 in the past. We've talked about these 3-year-old fillies ad nauseum, how they're just sort of a mediocre group. And I guess Cambier Bark was the best of this bunch, but the 115, it's just a decent number for these.
Yeah, it is. Just one note on the ground loss. That's a really good point. The thing with these slow pace races is the fast part of the race is around that second turn because they just go slow around the first turn. So it's not just that you lost ground. it's that you lost ground during the fast part of the race, which is when it matters. If you lost ground on the first turn when they're just kind of trotting around there, it really isn't that damaging. So good point on that. And you do want to watch out for horses that lose ground in these slow pace races.
That's actually a good transition into the next race. We're going to talk about the Jessamine, because when these fillies spun off the far turn, it seemed like they were about 10 across the racetrack. And I mean, credit to the third place finisher, Ask Bailey, who was drawn in post 14 and looked like she was about 10 or 11 wide off the far turn. She still was able to get up for third, although nobody in this race, the Jessamine, was any match for the winner, Sweet Melania. She just took the lead on the backstretch, just seemed to drag Jose Ortiz around there on the far turn, easily opened up on the field in the lane. This was a visually impressive performance, and maybe one that makes her the favorite, if not one of the favorites, for the Breeders' Cup Juvenile Fillies turf. The speed figure is respectable. I guess this also flatters the New York fillies that we saw in the Miss Grillo back a couple weeks ago, but this was an impressive effort.
It was. I would say the speed figure is respectable, but it's not anything that's going to blow me away. And if she is the favorite, I'd probably be against her in the Breeders' Cup. Depends who shows up, of course, but she got a 103 for the effort. I expected a bigger number when I sat down to do the work, given the margin of victory on turf. But I think the horses behind her, between the ground loss that you mentioned and having to just lose tons of lengths and swinging way wide and just not being that great, probably enhanced the margin. She's probably not quite as impressive as the visual would have gave you. I'm not knocking her. She's certainly a decent enough filly, but as a betting guy, she's one I'd probably want to take on.
Yeah, the horses that took a lot of money in this race, or the one of them, Jezebel's Kitten, was coming out of that impressive victory at Kentucky Downs. That was not the fastest race in the world, and I think that race was just exposed as containing a pretty weak field, despite the large purse that they offered. And the filly that came in from New York was just classier than them, Sweet Melania. I will say both of her performances at Saratoga this summer maybe even a little bit underrated, because her debut win, she did it so easy, or rather her turf debut win, she did so easily. And then I was watching back that PG Johnson where she lost to Cristal, and that was a race that kind of fell apart at the end, and she was wide around both turns. This filly's run really well in all of her starts, and I wouldn't argue with her as a major contender in the Breeders' Cup just because I don't really know what else is out there. I mean, I wasn't thrilled with some of the other prep races that we saw in this division. So she's a major player, and it always helps to have that kind of tactical speed where you can really place her on or near the lead, and she's not going to get too rank on you.
Yeah, no doubt. Like I said, you just got to see who shows up. That 103 may look really good. It's hard for me to say right now. We'll get those advanced PPs soon enough. I think we even have them out now in our store, but I haven't. I've looked at some of the bigger races. I haven't looked at the juvenile filly turf yet.
Yeah, I was having to make some preliminary morning lines for DRF for the 2-year-old races on Friday, and it seems like they're talking about some Euros coming over that might be pretty good. So obviously that would throw things into that would make the things a little tougher on the Americans, because typically a good Euro 2-year-old in these 2-turn races is going to be tough. The Franklin County, they ran on Friday, I believe, at Keeneland, 5.5 furlong race for the fillies and mares on the turf. And one of our favorites, Alexandra, got her vintage Del Rosario ride, just kind of sitting off the pace early, saving ground on the turn, finding that seam in the stretch, and just running over the top of the field. When this filly, or mare, I should say, gets the right kind of ride, she's got an awesome kick in the stretch.
Yeah, I would argue this is the best race of her career, and not just because I think it was a career best speed figure with a 115. She just blew these horses away when she got clear. She had swapped decisions with the runner-up Morticia the last couple times out, having lost to her at Kentucky Downs. And you mentioned this earlier. When I'm given the choice, I'm going to ignore the Kentucky Downs races. And don't get me wrong, lots of horses tend to run well when they came from Kentucky Downs. I just don't think it necessarily matters how well they ran at that track, with not necessarily where they finished. They do get some good conditioning there, but I think she was the best filly in here, and she wound up being the co-favorite with Morticia, but she proved much better than her.
Yeah, I think this is the fun division, and Morticia, she always runs well. She doesn't always win these races, but it seems like she's just dancing every dance and is always right there at the wire. So she's a really nice horse to have around. But Alexandra, when she gets that right kind of trip, she is just so tough to hold off in the stretch of these races. And I mean, I doubt any of these horses go on to face males in the future because I don't think they're quite that good. But she's just a fun horse to watch run, Alexandra. A couple non-stakes races to mention from Keeneland. One was a really nice allowance race on Thursday, going the 2 turns on the turf, and Sacred Life for Chad Brown, a horse who had run in a couple of stakes at Saratoga this summer, the Lure and the Bernard Baruch, had finished second in both of them to some Kieran McLaughlin trainees. Took a slight bit of class relief in this allowance race, and he really delivered with a nice performance.
He did. He got a 120 for the win. Looked super impressive doing it. I liked that he went back to that closing style that he showed in his North American debut there at Saratoga. He kind of got trapped the last time on that boggy course, chasing in the second position behind a clear leader. And I don't really think that's his best game. He was well off the pace here and really came flying at the finish. And I'm sure this horse is going to move right back in the stakes competition and be a threat for sure.
Yeah, there are some winter targets. Chad Brown sometimes sends a horse or two out to California for, I forget what the race is called out there in December that they run. That's a graded stakes. But there's also plenty of targets at Gulfstream Park over the winter for a horse like this. So I imagine they might keep him around since he's only had just 3 races this season so far since coming to the U.S. On Sunday, we saw a maiden race that for the 2-year-olds that looked pretty loaded with some live first-time starters. One in particular for Brad Cox took a ton of money, but it was one of the most experienced members of the field, Silver Prospector for Steve Asmussen, who really put forth a breakout performance here. A funny horse because they had targeted him for a turf career initially. He made 3 starts on the turf. This was actually his dirt debut and his 4th career start, and seems like he's actually a dirt horse.
Yeah, it sure does based on the number he got here. He ran a 111, which is really big for a 2-year-old. Even this late in the year, that's about as good as we've seen. I forget the name. What's it? 8 Rings is the juvenile favorite, I would assume. And he didn't run this fast winning his last race. So it was a big effort. Obviously, this is just a 1-turn race, but it was a strong field. Chad Brown had a promising runner. Get a 110 in second. And like you said, it looked loaded on paper. This is one when I made the figures, I didn't pay a whole lot of attention to the numbers. I kind of make the track variant. I plug them into the database and it spits out the numbers. And it really jumped out at me when I looked at the charts. I was like, whoa, 111. So I went back and just kind of looked at the worksheet again. And really, it was an easy figure making day. There wasn't a whole lot of data, but it was all really consistent. So I would expect this to be a strong race that's going to produce a lot of winners and fairly soon at that.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. The only 2-year-old that I can remember running faster so far this year is Dennis's Moment, who obviously is one of the best ones out there. But yeah, this is a really fast race. The runner-up Telephone Talker for Chad Brown and Ken Ramsey, he ran well as well. The one caveat I have about this race is that I see that pink color-coded race rating indicating that it was a track that was probably somewhat speed favoring. I watched a few races that day. That did seem to be the case, and especially watching this race, nobody did any running from the back of the pack, and it almost played out like the old Keeneland dirt surface from before they had that synthetic track watching this race, because it just seems like as they got into the stretch, all of the margins between the horses just got so exaggerated. Well, nobody made up any ground.
Yeah, I would agree with that. The one thing I'd say with our figures, they don't usually get very inflated because of track biases. If anything, they're an excuse for the horses below who get lower figures than normal. It's just kind of the methodology that we use at TimeformUS to try not to give those just crazy, ridiculous figures for horses that run off and, on a track that favors their style. And we just kind of try to give them what they would normally run, although that doesn't really apply because these are maidens, but based on the other races and just kind of giving an excuse to the ones that don't meet up to what you might have expected.
Yeah, this is a race that I'll be watching how horses run back out from in the future, because it does seem like there were some pretty talented runners in this field. And I think we'll learn if that's true in the upcoming months, especially if some of them run back at, I would assume, Churchill Downs for their upcoming meet. Let's move on to Belmont Park. We saw some stakes races and another 2-year-old maiden race that we'll discuss in a little bit. But let's begin with their pair of Grade 2 races that they ran this past weekend on the turf, beginning with the Knickerbocker that we just saw yesterday on Monday, the Columbus Day card. And the story coming into this race was this was going to be Catholic boys prep for an Breeders' Cup race that had not yet been determined. I don't think they got what they were looking for out of this race because he actually failed to hit the board here. And Luke Cullen, who's just been pretty reliable ever since they brought him back from that extended layoff earlier this summer, just showed up with another really good performance. He's actually the horse that had beaten Sacred Life, who we just mentioned in that allowance win at Keeneland. He had beaten him in the Lure up at Saratoga. And he just ran his typical speed figure here, got out into the clear in the stretch and just ran this field down.
Yeah, he got a 122, which is right around what he always runs. He got the good trip. He's just a tough, versatile horse. He's able to adapt to various pace scenarios. When the pace is slow, he sits a little closer. When it's fast, he drops back a little further. But the one thing with him is he's always finishing. So he's always going to be tough. He's going to be in these Grade 2, Grade 3 spots, going to be a force to be reckoned with. Catholic Boy was certainly disappointing, but to be honest, I don't think either one of us have ever thought all that highly of him, not as much as some other people. He's never really run particularly fast races, so he's always a bit of an underlay for me. I did hear him in an interview. I think one of our reporters at DRF, and I apologize for not remembering which one, said they were still considering the Breeders' Cup, but if they did go, it would be the Classic because he looked like a horse that needed more distance. I can't really argue with that. I guess if you're going to take a shot, that's probably the race to go in with it being in a bit of turmoil this year. He's certainly not a horse that would even remotely be a contender in the turf, so I'm not sure where else they'd go with him.
No, I agree. I think the Breeders' Cup in general is probably an ambitious target for a horse like this, especially a horse that people think pretty highly of and often gets bet quite a bit. Yeah, we talked about this on the forecast last week. He just hasn't run that fast on the turf. I know that Belmont Derby score was gritty and game when he beat Analyze It, but his other turf performances are just okay. And I would assume the Classic might be his opportunity to do best because I think 1.25 miles is the right distance for him. I just wonder if he's a little bit outclassed by horses at this stage. And he might be one of those 3-year-olds that just didn't take that step forward from 3 to 4 because we really haven't seen him better his performances from his 3-year-old season at all this year. I know there have been some setbacks, but it hasn't gone according to plan. I think that's something we could definitely say. Olympica, who was second in this race, I thought he ran okay. He's kind of been a bit of a head scratcher for Chad Brown. Depending on what kind of course he gets and what kind of distance. He shows up sometimes and doesn't other times, but he finished okay to be second. But I thought the real story in this race was just Luke Cullen being rock solid and just putting forth another really solid effort.
Yeah, the only other horse I'd mention here is Glorious Empire. Not that he did much running here, but I'm looking forward to seeing him get a shot at the longer distances. 1 3/8, 1.5 miles, where he's going to be on the lead, not have to deal with other speed, and see if he can get back to that form he had last year. I didn't think he had much chance at this shorter distance, but I'm not going to write him off just yet.
Yeah, he's a funny horse, and I know he's a really difficult horse for his connections because he's got so many of these quirks. He gets too upset before his races. He has a tendency to bleed a lot of the time. He did that a lot early in his career, even bleeding through Lasix at times. I know Maggie Wolfendale, Naira's paddock analyst, was talking about him because her husband used to train him early in their career, so she knows him well. And she was mentioning in her commentary before the race that the horse just kind of lost it once he got out on the track before this Knickerbocker and just wasn't behaving the way that he normally would when he runs well. So that's unfortunate, but I agree with you. Going a little bit longer is probably best for him. He did run that stellar race in the Fort Lauderdale going this distance last year, but he's been more consistent going a longer distances because he gets that front running trip that he really does prefer. Let's talk about the Sands Point, the other graded stakes from this past week at Belmont that took place on Saturday. Not the strongest field, certainly not as strong as the Queen Elizabeth that we saw at Keeneland that same day. But we did see a pretty nice winner of this race, new and improved for Chad Brown. Just her third career start. And She really made an impressive run from the back of the pack. I was a little surprised to see that this race was not coded as featuring a slow pace, but I get that a lot of these mile and an eighth races on the inner turf course at Belmont do feature slow paces, so it probably was right in line with what we see on average in races like this, given how they ride them. But still credit to this filly for closing down this field in this stretch under just a supremely confident ride from Joel Rosario.
Yeah, this was a race I didn't get to see live, and I saw your comment that Joel kind of rode her like a 3-5 shot. And then when I went back and watched the replay, you couldn't have been more right. This filly didn't look that strong on paper to me, but being Chad Brown, you probably, we talked about it on the forecast. Neither one of us were going to be surprised if she won. And we certainly thought she's probably going to be the best horse long term. And she looked pretty good. She got a 110 for the win. She won easier than the half length margin would indicate, in my opinion. And, you know, maybe she'll get better with better trips as distances maybe get a little bit longer. But again, she's one of those 3-year-olds. I'm going to let her take some more time to develop and just see how she comes back next year.
Yeah, I agree with that. I'm not sure that she's even as good yet as the horses that Chad Brown ran in the QE2, because she does have more to prove at this point. But she certainly took a step in the right direction for just her third career start. I do want to say that Junior Alvarado, who rode the second place finisher, Feel Glorious, really gave a fantastic ride. I mean, he saved a lot of ground, whereas New and Improved had to go around the field, albeit part of that was on a straightaway. But I thought he gave that runner-up every chance to win, and New and Improved was just a little bit better. On Sunday at Belmont, we saw yet another turf stakes race, the point of entry. This one's just a listed stakes race going 1.5 miles. And I think the distance really made a difference for a lot of horses in this race, particularly the winner, Red Knight, who we talked about a little bit before he ran that New York bred stakes in his prior start, going just 1.1 miles. And 1.1 miles is just not enough distance for Red Knight. He really is one of these marathon runners that's best going 1.5 miles. He could even go in as far as 2 miles, which we've seen him do a couple of times. And his stamina really won out in the end. Surprise performance from the runner-up Parrot, who took the lead away from Noble Indy, who I think most of us expected to be on the lead, but he just didn't have the stamina to hold off Red Knight late.
Yeah, it was a solid effort. The winner got a nice setup. And like you say, I think the winner was the distance was the difference in here. He got a 121 for the win. I personally was pretty fascinated by the runner-up. This was a horse who's primarily been a sprinter his entire career. I think he had only been as far as 1 mile one time, and that was back when he was in Australia. So for this horse to hang on for second, going 1.5 miles, setting a quick pace, I'm not sure if it says more about him or those behind him that couldn't quite reel him in, but it was a solid ride. It's the first time I've seen the name Edgar Prado in quite a while. I'll be the first to admit I don't pay a ton of attention to jockeys, but it's always good to see Edgar in the back riding well in New York. He's a guy I grew up with watching in Maryland dominate the circuit for a long time. So good rider, getting up there in years, but good to see him in. And I'll be tracking this one to see where Parrot shows up next, because it's really an intriguing performance that was hard to predict, if you ask me.
Yeah, that was a blast from the past, not just in the sense that you rarely see Edgar Prado's name much anymore, especially in these top-level races, but also the ride that he gave this horse. It was such a breath of fresh air because he rode this speed horse the way that you want to ride a speed horse, especially in one of these longer races when he got a little keen early on. And rather than just fighting him and trying to back down the pace so much and bringing everybody else into the race, he just let this horse settle on his own. He opened up about 3 lengths early and didn't worry about it. And the horse really did settle down and got a little bit of a breather and was able to kick on at the end. This is the way that you ride a speed horse. And so often we see riders just do the complete opposite and try to strangle these horses back. And it gets frustrating, but I think the ride really made the difference on a horse like this.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. They should show this one in riding class, wherever that's held.
Let's move on to the final stakes race we'll talk about from Belmont Park this past week, the Floral Park going 6 furlongs for the fillies and mares on the turf. I don't think this was the strongest race. I don't think any of the top 3 finishers really put forth their best efforts in this spot. But Fire Key, she's just a really solid runner who always shows up going this 6 furlong distance. She's really a specialist going this trip. And she gutted out the victory over Goldwood, who we had talked about a little bit on the forecast last week. These 5 and 5.5 furlong specialists can't always translate their best form to 6 furlongs. And I think that might be what happened with Goldwood here.
Yeah, that's the one thing I noted. It was probably the distance that got Goldwood. She ran well, but this race is right up Firekeys alley. She likes Belmont. She likes the 6 furlongs, and she got a perfect trip. She sat in behind horses. Her jockey Pimentel made the right move. He tipped out at the right time, and it's a good thing he didn't wait much longer because Goldwood was pretty game through the lane. She was fighting all the way to the wire, but was able to hold her off. So it came back pretty slow, 107 for both of the top two. So nothing to get too excited about. I was expecting a little faster, to be honest, but there was another race on the same course and distance. There were no real pace issues. So the number's a number. I mean, a 107 is what she ran.
Yeah, I thought Evil, the horse that I liked, ran okay to be third. I was shocked that she got that down to 3-1. I thought she'd be twice that price based on how poorly she ran in the prior race. Joel Rosario, I mean, he tried to do his thing with her. She might just be a horse that has that character flaw where she can't really get past horses at the end. She was coming, but just not quite fast enough. Run between the Floral Park and the Sands Point on Saturday was a maiden race that featured mostly horses that had run before, but there was one first-time starter in the mix, a Shar for Kieran McLaughlin. And I know this wasn't the fastest race that we've seen. It certainly wasn't as fast as that maiden race we just talked about from Keeneland. But for a 2-year-old first-time starter, I thought this was a pretty good effort from a Shar. He had worked well prior to this race. He's got quite a pedigree on him, and he was dominant in this victory. I mean, Joe Bravo just sort of geared him down in the final 16th.
He was. He got 100 for the win, which, as you know, that's earlier in the year we were talking about 100 for 2-year-olds being notable. Really, you know, we're into October now, the middle of October, so it's just decent. But I thought visually this horse ran well. He actually made a couple moves. He made a move early in the race to kind of take the lead, and then he let Extreme Force go ahead and pass him. But on the turn, he passed that horse at will and was really geared down to the wire. Perjury Trap, who was the big name horse coming in, I think he was the favorite when they went off from Chad Brown, second time out. Wasn't really making up much ground on him at all. So I did think it was a strong effort. As far as the others go, Starting Over was actually turning back in distance, which you don't often see for 2-year-olds. And he ran pretty well. But I'm most interested in your take on Perjury Trap. Is this a horse that just wants more distance, or is he going to be a closing sprinter?
Yeah, I don't know. He probably didn't get the right trip in this race because he was breaking from the rail, and breaking from the rail is fine if you break well, but Perjury Trap just didn't come out of the gate that well. He was about a length back after a few strides, and he just was like out the back of the pack early in last place, and that's not where you would have projected him to be based on his first start when he actually showed speed. So I just think having to adapt to a new running style probably had a negative effect on his performance in this race. The race did kind of fall apart behind Ashar, though. I mean, that might just be maybe the top three are just the best horses, and that doesn't mean anything because it didn't seem like the pace was that fast. And maybe the horses that were chasing Ashar in the early going just aren't that good. But I thought Perjury Trap ran okay at the end of the race to get up for third and be as close to second as he was. And I know the speed figure didn't come back that fast. I just think it's meaningful when Kieran McLaughlin sends out a first-time starter that wins these days. He's almost getting to be like Shug McGahee and not sending out these first-time starters that are really prepped to win first time out. And I was just looking back at a list of horses that are 2-year-olds that he's won with in their debuts over the past 5 years. And it's a pretty esteemed list of horses like Mohayman, Takafel, Enticed, Dream Pauline, horses that have gone on to graded stakes success. So pretty good sign that Ashar was able to get the job done in this debut for that trainer.
Yeah, good point about that, because that's one of my favorite angles is playing his horse's second time out. So when he wins first time out, it's certainly worth taking note.
All right, let's move on to a few other tracks before we wrap up the show this week, beginning with Gulfstream Park West, a track we don't often visit, but Bodie Express, a horse that we might remember from the Triple Crown Trail. He had that infamous performance in the Preakness, if you can call it that, when he dropped the rider at the gate and ran around and had the outrider make an appearance at the head of the lane. This was his first start since then, finally dropping down into a maiden race, and he got the job done with ease. However, there were some timing issues in this race, and I think the times that made it into the chart are pretty astounding, and I'll let you discuss that a bit, Craig.
Yeah, it was a little baffling. Of course, I wanted to do the figure for Bodie Express, which he wound up with a 98. I don't know that figure means anything in this case. He was in against 3 completely overmatched rivals. This was a horse that ran second to Chancelot, I believe it was, when Chancelot broke his maiden that really fast race. Of course, ran second in the Florida Derby. So he was just out to break his maiden and get some exercise. As far as the time goes, I thought I had seen it all, but it turned out that wasn't the case. As I was watching the replay, well, first I got flagged that there was something amiss with the times when I tried to generate my worksheet. When I looked, watching the replay, the mile time and the finish time, this race was at 1:70, both came up as less than a minute in the 40-second range. So clearly something went wrong. What it was, I have no idea. But then when I looked in the chart, I saw they had just added a minute to the times and put them in there. So I figured, well, maybe something went wrong with the video display and the times were fine. But, it took me about a second and a half to realize, well, if the 6 furlongs went in 1:12, they certainly didn't run a mile in 1:42. Bodie Express is probably not capable of walking a quarter mile in 30 seconds, I wouldn't think. So anyway, I don't really know what happened with the time. We're dealing with Equibase. I'm sure they'll change it and put something in there. I tried timing the race from video because of the, let's just say, less than optical view you get of the races at Gulfstream Park West. It's really tough to be precise. So this race is just, from a figure making perspective, I did the best I could. If you look in our charts now, you're going to see pace figures, but I've actually decided I'm going to take those away. It's not because the early fractions were wrong. I think they were right, but I don't want to put a ratio in there to show the pace figures as one thing and the final time as another when I'm just not confident in the final time. So this race is just going to be an overall rating for each horse in there. It's probably good for the 2 through 4 finishers. For Bodie Express, as I said, I doubt it means much of anything.
It's kind of funny. I was laughing when I watched this and you alerted me to it because it's just this perfect combination of really frustrating factors that really doesn't allow you to do the job that you set out to do, which is, it's unfortunate that you have to deal with those kinds of incidents. But things happen. Sometimes the races just can't be timed properly, and we see it from track to track. But yeah, I'm assuming Bodie Express did not run a 30-second quarter mile. That seems to defy belief. But just to get back to Bodie Express for a second, as you were saying, he's a pretty neat horse, and it's not every day you see a horse who's grade 1 placed breaking his maiden after achieving that grade 1 placing. So he can certainly do better than this in the future. I don't think he was all out to win this race by any means.
No, not at all. And who knows where he'll show up next, but he'll probably be overbet. So we'll see.
A race that wasn't originally on my radar, but when I was just kind of scrolling through the charts, I took another look at it, was the stakes race from Parks on Saturday, the MP Bolletzi Appreciation Mile, quite a name for a race, which was won by the 3-year-old Spun to Run, beating older horses in this spot. And when I watched this race, this horse just dragged his rider to the lead around the far turn, was basically on cruise control at the quarter pole, was geared down for the final eighth of a mile. I don't often say that horses could have run a lot faster, but this horse probably could have run a little bit faster. And as it is, here into 125 TimeformUS speed figure.
Yeah, this horse is getting really good. I'm pretty sure we talked about him after his Haskell, where he ran a deceptively good third. I think he hadn't run in March, and he came back in that spot against Maximum Security, and he ran a sneaky good race. He came back to win the Smarty Jones after that. He ran only 5th in the Pennsylvania Derby, but I think he was only beaten like a length and a half, and he really just exploded here. Granted, the competition wasn't much, but he ran fast, and he did it the way you're supposed to. And I think this is a really dangerous 3-year-old right now. These were older horses that he beat, but I'm really looking forward to seeing where this horse shows up next because he just looked full of run, as you say. He looked like he could have kept going for a while. And we actually knocked that 125 back a couple points. The final time was a 127, but the pace was pretty slow. So just it's a rare time you see a horse run this fast outside of one of the big circuits, and I like this horse.
I agree, and it kind of validates the speed figure that Pennsylvania Derby got, because I know that wasn't the most visually impressive race for a lot of people, since the top five finishers finished so close together. It was just sort of a blanket finish. But Spun to Run came back out of that race and ran even faster in this spot, and he strikes me as the kind of horse that really is a true miler. I don't know if he really wants to go the mile and an eighth distance, but going the mile, it just seems like he drags his rider into the race and can really use that late kick going this distance. I don't know if he's the kind of horse that's even nominated to the Breeders' Cup, or if that's what they're considering. But I mean, based on who may or may not be showing up for the Breeders' Cup Dirt Mile, which apparently has a sponsor that I'm not going to say right now, that's not the strongest field. And I'm assuming, or I'm hoping rather, that Mitole doesn't run there, because I think that would be unfortunate if his connections decided to choose such an easy spot like that and really duck the top sprinters. But if Mitole doesn't run in the Dirt Mile, that race is kind of there for the taking. So, I mean, why wouldn't a horse like this be competitive in there?
Yeah, that's the exact spot I was thinking of when I was saying I'm really curious to see where he shows up. Like you, I don't know if he's nominated. That stuff all comes out soon enough, so I don't waste my time looking up things like that. And what we'll know, and I'm sure we'll talk about the Breeders' Cup. Mitole, that would baffle me if he ran in the Dirt Mile, having never been two turns. Not saying he couldn't handle it, but anyway, we'll save that for another day.
Yeah, we'll talk about that in a week or two. Let's wrap up the show by moving out to California to talk about a couple of races from Santa Anita on Sunday, beginning with the stakes race they ran on that card, the Anokia Stakes for the 2-year-old fillies. And Leucothea, who's been a little bit of an enigma so far in her career. She was coming off a non-performance in the Chandelier, where she dropped her rider. She had basically been eased before that in the Del Mar Debutante, but she had run a pretty eye-catching speed figure in her maiden claiming victory at Del Mar this summer, and she got back to that kind of performance here, turning back to a sprint distance. Really worked out for her.
Yeah, she ran that huge 110 back at Del Mar, I think it was, went in for a tag, and actually took quite a bit of money next start out in stakes, but didn't run very well, lost her rider last time out. But she exploded again. She got a 108 here. It's going to be about 108. I don't have the official figures from Sunday, and I'll post those when I get them. But I'm pretty sure it'll be right in that ballpark. So the one thing I can say about her right now is you can say if she gets clear, she's super dangerous. She looks like a totally different filly if she does. If she doesn't, but when she's clear, she just seems to keep going and run away from everyone. And be curious to see where she shows up and how much other speed's in there. But it's certainly not, the number's not anything to sneeze at.
Yeah, she's one of these Jekyll and Hyde kind of horses. She either runs her good race or she's just absolutely nowhere. I was actually surprised that she was as high as 2-1 in this race, not to Redboard, because this wasn't a race that I really handicapped beforehand. But I mean, the horse that they made even money had never really run the kind of speed figure that she was capable of running. I know she's not the most reliable horse, but her best race was just far and away superior to the other horses in this field. So given that she showed up, it was no surprise that she won by this kind of margin. The other race that we'll talk about from the 2-year-olds on Sunday was a maiden race at a mile earlier in the card. A horse that I think a lot of people have been very high on since his debut for John Sheriff's out in California is Honor AP. He ran, I believe, 6 furlongs in his debut there, closing to be second at Del Mar in a race that came up reasonably fast, but given his pedigree and given just the physical impression that he makes, he seems like a horse that would really want to go the 2 turns, and that certainly proved to be the case in this second start of his career, stretching out to the mile. He showed uncharacteristic early speed and then just basically widened in the stretch once Mike Smith asked him.
Yeah, he came out of that Fast Ginobili race. He was the runner-up, and that race has actually turned out to be pretty productive if you scroll through the charts. I had a few winners come out of it. Few other horses have hit the board while really improving their figures. So no doubt it was a strong maiden race. But I think what was really eye-catching was the new dimension of his early speed. Obviously, it's a 2-turn race versus a 1, but this horse was dead last time, well behind the pace, whereas he was able to make the lead here pretty easily and just draw away late. He's a promising ridgeling for sure. Based on the data I saw, I would estimate he's going to get about a 109 TimeformUS speed figure, which is very strong, as we've talked about already. Anything around that 110 this time of year for a 2-year-old He's going to be a handful. I would assume it's too late for him to make the Breeders' Cup. A guy like John Sheriff usually isn't going to rush a horse like this, but maybe the Los Al Futurity, which comes up later in the year. I'm not sure where they'll send him, so no point in speculating. But he's a horse with some promise, no doubt about it.
Yeah, it seems like non-winners of one allowance races are a thing of the past for the 2-year-olds these days with all the stakes opportunities out there. But I imagine we would see him in the stakes next time out because this was a really nice performance. And he's a cool looking horse. He's this son of Honor Code who kind of like his sire has all these white markings on him. He's got those high white stockings on his front legs. And he never looks like he's running that fast. But coming around the second turn, you could just see he hadn't really given all that Mike Smith had asked him for yet. And he just kept widening the stretch and was really galloping out strongly. He really strikes me as one that's going to go on with that at distance. He's out of that very good Damn Hollywood Story, who was a grade 1 winning router. She's produced some talented runners, though none that have really fulfilled their potential in graded stakes races yet. But wouldn't be surprising if this colt is that one, or Ridgeling is that one, because this was the right kind of maiden breaking victory. That's all the racing we're going to recap this week. As always, you can listen to us on drf.com, Spotify, iTunes, YouTube, and SoundCloud. We're going to continue to do the 2 podcasts every week, so we'll be back on Friday with another episode of the DRF or the TimeformUS forecast. We'll talk a little bit about which races we're going to discuss because I didn't look at the stake schedule, Craig, but I don't think there are that many major races coming up this weekend.
No, I think it's all state breds pretty much everywhere. It's the big state bred days, which from a betting perspective sometimes can be pretty good and even better than these graded stakes. So I'm sure we'll find something to talk about.
Yeah, I know they've got that day of New York bred stakes races coming up at Belmont. So maybe I'll take a look and see if those races come up as intriguing handicapping affairs, because that usually is the case. So maybe we'll talk about a few of those. And then probably over the next couple of weeks, we'll do a little bit more of a deep dive into the Breeders' Cup races. I believe pre-entries are coming out within the next week or week and a half or so. So we'll talk about all that once that gets firmed up a little bit. But things to look forward to on the TimeformUS Pacecast and the TimeformUS forecast. So thanks for listening this week, guys. And we'll talk to you again on Friday.